I would like to start by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today. I also acknowledge that we have a number of parties joining us on Zoom today from other regions of Australia. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of those regions and pay my respects to elders past and present. All right, thank you very much everyone for coming along this morning. Really great to see an excellent attendance list. My name's Keith Langhouse. I work for ENGIE. I'm the Alliance Manager. I'm delighted to be able to introduce today's research by Dr. Paris Hadfield. It's an outcome of the Monash-ENGIE Alliance. The Alliance was formed with the goal of creating both operational and research opportunities and is a natural fit for the living laboratory approach. I'll just turn at this point, I would like to introduce Professor Jack Jaseniak to provide an overview of the Monash perspective. Professor Jaseniak is Pro Vice Chancellor, Research Infrastructure at Monash University. Jack joined Monash from CSIRO in 2015 as an Associate Professor and was appointed Director of the cross-disciplinary Monash-ENGIE Institute. In 2020, he was promoted to full Professor and became the Associate Dean of Research for the Faculty of Engineering before being promoted to his current role in December 2021. His research interests include the development of nanomaterials and their use in various next-generation energy technologies to enable a net zero carbon emission future. His contributions have been broadly showcased in the media on topics ranging from energy poverty to smartphone batteries to developing solar windows and creating net zero cities through large-scale solar cell deployment. Professor Jaseniak, I'll throw to you now.
Thank you very much, Keith, for that introduction, and a warm welcome to you all. In my role, I deliberately look at research infrastructure, which is embodying the enabling capabilities that support all of research across Monash. Now, living labs play a really important purpose in that portfolio. And from our view at Monash, they represent an example of what is best practice in terms of social research infrastructure, something that brings together real-world experimentation, something that brings about and brings together community, government, business, NGOs, and researchers both on and off the campus to address global challenges, which ultimately go beyond any one of those groups. Now, Living Labs center university industry research partnerships. They build experiential learning for students. They use the campus as a test bed and an ability to drive knowledge translation and commercialization for social and other types of impact. Within Monash, we've got our Impact 2030 strategy, which is really focused around driving various forms of impact. And clearly the implementation and the ideas that Living Labs bring support the breadth and the level of impact that we have ambitions to achieve. Now, my own experience within Living Labs really started about 7 years ago when we started to plan the Monash microgrid. The microgrid was envisaged as an interconnected electrical network that enabled high renewable energy penetration across our campus and provided a test bed for us to understand the implementation and the optimization of new technologies so that we could support the better interaction between electricity production through renewables and ultimately the use of that electricity around that campus. Now that Living Lab supported our net zero initiative, which was an ambitious and bold initiative where Monash outlined its ambitions to become carbon neutral by 2030. We're one of the first universities in the world, certainly in Australia, to have such claims. And that was a United Nations award-winning initiative. Now, our current work looks to extend on these preliminary Living Lab examples. And so we are actively looking to understand how do we accelerate Living Labs that are underway or being planned across Monash, including the Human ISC, the National Centre for Healthy Aging Living Lab, the Turner Living Lab, the Net Zero Emissions Bus Living Lab, and ultimately the Net Zero Precincts ARC Linkage Living Labs, which is obviously a key part of the webinar here. These examples demonstrate the breadth and the potential to drive various forms of interdisciplinary research and education. Now, critically, it's really important that we recognize the importance of a strategy, a coherent strategy to support such living labs so that they are embodied within the university fabric, to realize the level of engagement that's needed to make sure that they're successful and to ultimately drive impact. It's only in this way that living labs can be coordinated across the university to create what ultimately should be ecosystems that support best practice, excellent research, education, and a collaborative way of thinking in terms of research and innovation, and ultimately bringing all sorts of partnerships. Now, university living lab design, implementation, knowledge transfer, broad participation across the disciplines, the settings that are required to support such social research infrastructure through engagement, the relationship building skills, capacity building, and peer support. These things need to all come together in a system to make living labs successful. Now, mature living labs ultimately accelerate across many of these interdependent factors. And so for us to become better at deploying successful living labs, we need the right types of structures and support mechanisms to ensure that such living labs achieve the broad set of outcomes that they have the potential to achieve, and ultimately drive impact for a range of stakeholders. Now, from my experience, we know that getting this right across the complexity isn't easy. And so for that reason, I'm very excited, and I'm an active learner in this space. And I'm very excited to learn more about how we can institutionally improve on our living lab journey. And with this release of the Governing University Living Labs for Sustainable Development report by the Monash-ENGIE Alliance, I'm really excited to hear the insights from the experts, as well as hearing from the global experts on the panel today, which bring their own unique geographic and experiential perspectives. So in closing, let me extend my congratulations to the team who have worked on the report and putting together this wonderful webinar. So with that, let me introduce to you Dr. Paris Hatfield to provide a summary of the research findings and the recommendations in the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jack, and to Keith for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to the audience for joining us today. I'm really pleased to be sharing this report. The report was co-authored by me and my colleagues at Monash Sustainable Development Institute, Dr. Darren Sharp, Sam Wright, and Professor Rob Raven, and our ENGIE colleagues in France and Singapore, Muresh Saraya, Jonas Pigeon, and Xiaoyang Peng. This research was funded by the Monash-ENGIE Alliance Solutions Fund, and as has been said already, this in itself provides an example of a university industry partnership approach to applied research. So I'd like to extend my sincerest thanks to Muresh, Jonas, and Xiaoyang for their generous and insightful contributions to the research design, data collection, and analysis in this collaboration. This report would not have been possible without the research participants who offered their time and valuable insights, which are at the core of this study. Their voices are included throughout the report to bring to life not only the challenges of doing university living labs, but the value and potential in orchestrating these initiatives. This project aims to develop recommendations for effective governance frameworks for university living labs to address global challenges, such as Monash University's transition to net zero emissions. We define a university living lab as a social and material infrastructure within a university for enabling a multitude of place-based, interdisciplinary, and impact-oriented research, education, operations, and enterprising projects of the university in collaboration with societal partners. Our research questions are: how are university living labs organised and embedded in university policies and frameworks? And how do governance arrangements impact the continuity and coherence of university living lab activities? To answer these questions, we conducted 37 interviews with academics and professional staff involved in living labs across 18 universities. These include Deakin, Monash, RMIT, Melbourne, and Tasmania and Western Sydney universities in Australia, the State University of Campinas, Brazil, Concordia, British Columbia, and Toronto in Canada, La Rochelle University in France, the University of Stuttgart, Germany, TU Delft, the Netherlands, and Utrecht University in the Netherlands, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore, Edinburgh and Manchester universities in the UK, and Ohio State University in the US. Our interviews explored the visions and objectives for university living labs, organisational structures and roles and responsibilities, how decisions are made, how university living labs are resourced, and achievements and lessons learned. For the remainder of this presentation, I'll talk through the key research findings and recommendations in the report, starting with the question of why university living labs. Jack's introduction gave us a sense of this value proposition for university living labs. The first key value of university living labs highlighted by respondents is achieving research impact. Impact is a strategic priority and responsibility for universities to demonstrate the social relevance of research and education. Living labs provide spaces for researchers to meaningfully engage with diverse stakeholders from the outset, develop shared understanding of problems, and learn from real-world testing of potential solutions. For the University Living Lab programs in our sample, impact is explicitly oriented to sustainability and climate change. And this value is illustrated by this quote from Western Sydney University. We have 500 buildings, 10 campuses. We're like a distributed local government area. And all of the professionals dealing with our area deal with the realities, whether they're transitions to renewable energy, all the things that people look at around our community, they also occur within our campus. The second key value is in enabling experiential learning for students. Living Lab projects provide students with the opportunity to pursue their interests and apply theoretical knowledge in practice. For example, working with practitioners on and off campus, where students can develop skills and insights relevant to future employment and civic participation. And this quote from the University of Manchester highlights this element of student employability. The number of students we have who've got jobs based on the Living Lab project they did. Some of them have got jobs with organisation they did the report for, but far more common is that they can talk about it in job interviews, and it's absolute gold dust. A third key value and feature of a University Living Lab approach is the integration of stakeholders and activities across institutional silos, such as between campus operations and academic staff, between academic disciplines, and with external partners. University Living Lab activities are underpinned by relationships between diverse stakeholders and provide space for collaboration through on and off campus projects, thematic committees, and university-wide initiatives. This quote from Monash highlights the business case of this kind of integration. The university's primary business is education from a commercial perspective, and then research as well. The Living Lab approach allows us to use our multi-billion-dollar campus infrastructure not only for spaces for teaching and research, but allows them to use that investment to support teaching and research as well. You're getting double bang for buck on what that investment is. We identify 4 key functions of University Living Labs that realise these outcomes. As a research process, they involve social learning through collaboration and engagement with external stakeholders based on principles of co-design, interdisciplinarity, and experimentation in a real-world setting, oriented towards innovation and systems change. As a teaching practice, students can learn from and participate in applied research and industry engagement. As an integrated campus management approach, University Living Labs involve experimentation with and innovative utilisation and management of campus environments and specific built natural and digital assets. As a partnership and engagement approach, they involve multi-stakeholder collaboration to address global challenges, demonstrate real-world impact, and attract research funding. Nevertheless, our research demonstrates that there are no uniform organising structures for actually achieving these outcomes. In terms of organisational approaches, some labs like Western Sydney, Deakin and the University of Melbourne are conducted through the University's Sustainability Office. Others are governed by representative Living Lab steering committees like at Toronto, or thematic working groups like at the State University of Campinas. University Living Labs are guided by a range of policy frameworks, including university sustainability and impact strategies and the UN SDGs. Some cases also respond to or are supported by government directives, and these include municipal decarbonisation strategies in the case of La Rochelle University, climate targets for campuses in the case of Stuttgart University, and national government research policy priorities in the case of Nanyang Technological University. University Living Lab funding ranges from internal seed funding schemes like at British Columbia to industry procurement agreements such as Ohio State University partners and fee-for-service revenue models such as the Green Village at TU Delft. Finally, the cases pursue a range of knowledge translation approaches, including commercialization of technologies, education of students, professionals, and communities, and access to databases, public tours, and websites. So what did our interviews tell us about the key challenges for embedding Living Lab programs in universities? Well, the most common challenge identified by respondents is poor coordination of activities and stakeholders. University Living Labs often lack long-term strategy. This can mean that changes in staff or leadership affect the continuity of a program, or that investment and activities are not consistently supported, illustrated by this quote from Deakin. Probably the most common thing that I see happening is that a conversation starts about a Living Lab project, but what ends up happening is that one area or another benefits, but the others don't. So it might be that research operations and teaching is spoken about initially, but in the end, it kind of peters off and research just benefits. We're not closing the loop into the operational part of the project or the teaching. Because Living Labs span different parts of the university, program ownership can also be unclear, which can stall decision-making and affect buy-in among stakeholders. Centralised university systems can direct attention and resources to support Living Labs, but can conflict with distributed governance of academic faculties. Other limitations include a lack of clear and uniformly implemented systems and frameworks for things like access to data, establishing industry partnerships, and institutional learning. A second key challenge highlighted by all the respondents is that ad hoc and project-based funding is not enough to realise the potential of a University Living Lab. So short-term and finite funding creates uncertainty, limits continuity, and focuses efforts on immediate needs. This can result in a lack of investment in collective infrastructures for ongoing use or effective program coordination, monitoring, and evaluation. This challenge is illustrated by a quote from the University of Manchester. The problem we had, and it's a problem a lot of places have, is you get a tranche of money to set something up, but it's essentially project funding. So it's a lump of money for a certain period of time, and then you're constantly reapplying for more money to keep the thing going. This is not a sustainable way to run something which essentially should be part of the teaching and research infrastructure. Moreover, workload and time constraints present acute challenges for University Living Lab initiatives. Some staff characterise this work as voluntary effort outside of their primary roles and responsibilities, while standardised academic performance metrics don't often adequately recognise Living Lab outcomes compared with traditional research outputs, and this can really disincentivise participation. While collaboration across disciplines and broader institutional silos of research, teaching, operations, and enterprise is at the core of a University Living Lab approach, achieving this in practice remains challenging due to incumbent cultural norms at universities. At times, University Living Labs prompt territorial behaviour over existing boundaries of functional units, or they generate conflict in terms of ownership of facilities and activities between Living Lab parties. Some researchers can lack experience and knowledge for engaging with professional staff at the university. In other instances, collaboration can be hindered by stigma and ego, such as questions around the ability of academics to operate in a real-world context and an assumed hierarchy of expertise between academics and professional staff. This quote from the University of Toronto highlights how university living labs can also present risks to existing ways of working. The challenge for early career faculty is that it takes longer if you're involving non-academic partners in a deep way. It just inescapably takes longer because you've got to spend time just working together. Second, you end up producing a lot of non-academic outputs because that's what your partners want to have. And third, when you do publish, it tends to be in more interdisciplinary journals, which can be lower status in various disciplinary environments. Collaboration also poses practical challenges, such as differences in academic calendars compared with workflows of operations staff. Finally, respondents argued that broad mobilisation of stakeholders on campus to participate in university living labs is constrained by a lack of shared understanding. This is partly because the living lab concept is novel, abstract, open to interpretation, and sometimes contested, such as whether experimentation is fully realised or whether all decisions are made collectively. This Monash quote illustrates how lab language can alienate some researchers. We've mentioned this concept of living lab, and the feedback that I've had was, as soon as you mention a lab, it sounds like it's an engineering or science project. So in some ways, I think even that living lab terminology is skewed. A further barrier to generating awareness and interest in university living labs is the limited dissemination of knowledge, outcomes, opportunities, and available resources. As a result, there is a risk of relying on individual champions with knowledge and understanding to initiate and maintain living lab activities. A respondent from the University of British Columbia remarked that it's really funny, we've often had more attention from outside the university, people going, wow, you've got a really great program here. On campus, people are going, what the heck's that? Overall, these insights provide rich context for the critical components of university living lab governance. So this diagram synthesizes the 4 enablers we've identified for effective university living lab governance. In this diagram, we position diverse living lab projects as a portfolio of activities involving industry collaboration and which span the 4 pillars of university research, teaching, operations, and engagement. First, flexible coordination is key to enabling collaboration and access to resources without stifling emergence and experimentation. University living labs benefit from a decision-making authority and a strategic vision and objectives to overcome institutional silos, speed up implementation, and mobilise resources, as well as clarifying program ownership. Convening and representing diverse stakeholders ensures that the strategic vision reflects stakeholder preferences and interests from the outset, while centralised facilitation and knowledge sharing enables broad access to resources. Second, a coordinated approach necessitates investment in salaried personnel, such as for administrative support, as well as capabilities like skills in integration and interdisciplinarity. University living labs also benefit from investment in supporting systems such as partnerships development, commercialization, data management, and communications. Next, relationship building across institutional silos, disciplines, and external partnerships is really critical to achieving buy-in, as well as delivering projects and ultimately embedding living lab approaches and activities in the day-to-day work of university staff. Interpersonal connections are a key ingredient for cultivating trust, where influential and respected champions also play a role. Finally, communication is needed to establish a shared understanding of the purpose, objectives, and intended outcomes for living lab activities. Disseminating knowledge and building a public profile generates momentum and demonstrates the value and outcomes of university living labs to cultivate buy-in, particularly among senior leadership. To conclude, the report offers the following practical recommendations for advancing University Living Lab governance and to support long-term transformative impact agendas at universities. Establish a steering group with broad representation of academic and professional staff and students for strategic planning and engagement. Identify and develop transparent and accessible toolkits, resources, and processes to aid effective coordination. Invest in a core team to promote and support Living Lab activities and capacity building. Develop broad stakeholder engagement and participation to co-design or reimagine the value proposition of Living Labs for the university, business, government, and civil society. Develop a shared definition of a University Living Lab to enable inclusive and broad participation. And establish systems and metrics for impact assessment, monitoring and evaluation, and dissemination of outcomes. And with that, I'd now like to introduce Professor Rob Raven to facilitate our expert panel. So Professor Rob Raven is an interdisciplinary scholar, Professor of Sustainability Transitions, and Deputy Director of Research at Monash Sustainable Development Institute. He's also a visiting professor at Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University. Rob co-founded the Global Sustainability Transitions Research Network in 2012 and has made major contributions to multi-level theories of transformative change, socio-technical experimentation, and strategic niche management. His empirical work has covered urban, energy, and mobility transition processes in Europe, Asia, and Australia. His current research agenda focuses on transformative change in an urban context, including how actors, socio-technical experimentation, institutional change, and incumbency in urban regimes co-produce sustainable city futures. So he's the perfect moderator for this panel, I think. So I'm really grateful for you to be here, Rob. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Paris, and especially thank you also for presenting such an excellent overview of the report in such a concise and really accessible way. So in the next 30 minutes, we will hear from 4 great panelists, their thoughts and comments on the governance of University Living Labs report. After the panel session, I will invite the audience to participate in the debate, as Keith already alluded to, through a moderated Q&A session. So please consider and take note of any questions or comments that you might have, listening through different panel contributions, and then there's opportunity to address those in the final Q&A session. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Dr. Catherine Elliott. Dr. Catherine Elliott is a Senior Sustainability Officer at the University of Tasmania. For 3.5 years, Catherine has coordinated the Sustainability Integration Program for Students called SIPS, which is an internationally awarded winning program that provides opportunities for students and staff to work on projects tackling real-world sustainability challenges. She's also the current facilitator for the Education for Sustainability Communities of Practice. And Catherine loves mentoring students and collaborating with teams to tackle sustainability challenges across the university. So over to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Rob. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I am meeting and gathering with you today in Nipaluna, Hobart, which is home to the Moonena people for over 60,000 years. And you can see in my photo behind me, Kunyani, our mountain, and we have Timtumili Minanya, the river, in front of me as well. I would like to pay my respects to Tasmanian Aboriginal people who continue to care for our country. This includes our skies, our seas, waterways, land, people, and living plants and animals as well. I'd like to start by thanking Paris and the research team for undertaking this research, because this is about a program that I feel very passionate about. And for me, this is at the heart of what makes us a good university. And when we're when we're working really well together. So I'm fortunate to work in a university context where I have seen big changes that have come about through SIP's program and through student, staff and community members working together. I guess I represent more than 2,500 students who have been part of our program for over 12 years, and 50 staff who have been involved in mentoring student projects over that time as well. And these people have led incredible changes. So in Tasmania, our university has managed to 100% divest from fossil fuels. And we not only divested from fossil fuels, but we are also positively investing in sustainability projects. And that is how we have sustainable funding for these 5 years for our student internship program. We also think that student union might have become the first student union to be 100% fully on-site renewably powered, and that's only because we couldn't find another student union in the Southern Hemisphere who'd done this earlier, so I might be mistaken and maybe your university has also achieved this. We've also been certified carbon neutral since 2016. And all of these big changes that have been made have come about through the commitment of staff and students and the contributions of practical projects and research projects to enable these changes. So I'm really proud of all that we have achieved. And I think that given the complexity of the challenges we face, it is really exciting to be able to point to real change that has been able to be made. I think that in reviewing the research, the quote that was learnt, or the learning from our university, was about the importance of investing in sustainability and investing in the sustainability team. And that's had a really big impact for our university, and it's taken us from project-based projects where we're building on learnings each year to having a far more broader long-term strategy for change. And that's really important, because when students come to work with us, they can see the piece of the puzzle and how their project fits into the bigger picture of change that we're working towards. But I also wanted to mention that while that investment is crucial, it relies on people who are passionate and committed in order to make those changes happen. And it isn't enough to have the investment alone. The other reflection that I wanted to make was that as a team in sustainability, we include a very big number of students each year. So we have around 50 students working with us. And that means that we're highly networked and collaborative across the university. And here at UTAS, we're very fortunate to have an existing network of academic and professional staff. That's our Education for Sustainability Community of Practice. And that enables us to learn about research opportunities and to have long-term relationships with academics across the uni as well. We are also highly networked within our wider Tasmanian community, and we're founding members of groups such as the UNSDG Tasmania group, and that allows us to work actively and collaboratively with our community partners as well. And the final reflection I wanted to make was about the importance of diversity. So for us here at UTAS, it is really important to us that each year in the programs that we're running, we have both a diversity of skills and experiences, diversity of passion in the students who are coming to work with us, and that brings something exciting and a richness to our program. It allows us to tackle problems that we might face in ways that we weren't anticipating, and to be able to come up with ideas that are new and novel as well. So that was my final reflection on what I think enables us to have a really exciting program at UTAS.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for those contributions. I really enjoyed and I'm interested in what you talked about in terms of how this is making, according to is at the heart of makes a good university, and also really keen to learn more about that sort of funding model that you came up with through investing in sustainability projects and how that has been enabling you to keep investing in a longer term strategy, while also making the point that people matter. So I think that's something that shouldn't be forgotten either. So thanks for those contributions. And I would like to introduce our next speaker, Hubert Linssen from TU Delft in the Netherlands. Hubert is a program manager, sustainability at TU Delft. He has a Master of Science in Mechanical Engineering and co-founded the field lab Green Village after having worked a decade in the process industry at big industries, including Shell and Tata Steel. And currently, Hubert is responsible for the sustainable transition of the campus of Technical University Delft. And he has also initiated an innovation and implementation process for facilitating innovations on campus. Over to you, Hubert.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you all, Paris, especially for having me here. It's 11:30 in the night, so it's rather late here in Europe, but anyway, I'm very interested to hear all the insights. So let me reflect on the report. It is an extensive research. I was impressed by the amount of the living labs that were approached and also responded. And I observed a variety of approaches, and that was actually, for me, also good to reflect on. So what are we doing from TU Delft perspective? I recognized and I completely agree with a couple of these challenges that you wrote down in the report and also the enablers. So what I also do see is that to make actually a good distinct in between the differences in the purposes of each approach. So there were a couple of differences in the why. If you first start with the why and then the what and how, then the why is in a sense making a big difference in how are you proceeding with the what and how. So if you have proposed to have more student participation, then of course you have a different approach in funding and also in the governance. You also saw a lot of field labs that focus on campus operation performance and also the sustainability performance of their campus. And thirdly, I saw a couple of living labs that focus on accelerating these innovations to have impact on society. So, so I would like to recommend actually that, and maybe that could be elaborated also in the dialogue and the discussion, that what, so if you distinct in between these differences, then you have completely different governance as well. The perspective from TU Delft is actually to have a living lab, because we believe that the society of nowadays is very complex, and we need to prepare our future engineers on those complex society. Different cultures that need to, stakeholders that need to cooperate, a high speed of innovations, while the regulators often are lagging. You have to create value for all the stakeholders that are involved, investors, startup, local authorities, researchers, the users. So you do not only have to do it from the technical point of view, so the technical university often thinks only from a technical perspective, but of course also from the legislation point of view, from the business model, and also from the point of view of eliminating your technical hurdles. At the campus university, as a program manager for the campus, I first started to build a shared vision. And that shared vision was not only to make the campus more sustainable in 2030, so CO2 neutral, but also to say that if we can facilitate innovations that take away hurdles so that we can increase the impact and accelerate innovations for society, then that is really based and resonating with our own missions as a university that is impact for a better society. So that is how we got the interest of the CFB, our directors. And the next step was actually to set up a systematic portfolio approach, a funnel, so where we indeed do avoid that there are ad hoc projects, but one systematic selection and a steering committee by a broad that has a broad view on all different perspectives, and also to bring those cultures together. So in the end, that is something that we got now really set up, and that is indeed resonating as well with the report enablers and challenges. So I'm really seeing a lot that we use currently, and I'm also happy to tell you more about that in the dialogue later on, or even to share that later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hubert, for those great thoughts as well, and how you have briefly explained how Delft University got to establish, let's say, such a unique, I guess, and successful approach to living labs, and how you managed to also convince internally high-level university management to get on board with these ideas. I think that's a great example, as well as your thoughts on that the why really matters in terms of what flows from that in terms of governance and focus points. So thanks for those great contributions. And now I would like to introduce our next speaker, who has traveled all the way from Sweden to Australia, not just for this webinar, I should say. And that's Dr. Julia Voitenko-Palgan. Julia is a researcher and an associate professor in sustainable development at the International Institute for Industrial Environmental Economics at Lund University in Sweden. She has over 12 years of experience in multicultural, multidisciplinary, and interdisciplinary teams. And she works in the areas of sustainability, urban governance, innovation, and sustainable consumption. Her research is focused on strategies for sustainable solutions in new economies, such as the sharing economy, the bioeconomy, and the circular economy, and as well as on sustainable urban transformations, including topics such as nature-based solutions in cities, and last but not least, urban living labs. So over to you, Julia.
Thank you very much, Rob. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me. And it is really a pleasure also to be today in Melbourne to be able to comment on the report that has been produced in Melbourne. Yes, I'm coming from Lund University in southern Sweden, which has quite recently started also working with sustainability issues strategically, having a sustainability strategy and establishing a sustainability forum, which is a formalized structure to manage this sustainability strategy. Our institute, the International Institute for Industrial Environmental Economics, is an international interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research institute that has 2 educational programs, which are also have a lot of courses that are promoting applied research and collaboration with the actors in society. So my inputs today, I think, will be from 2 perspectives: my previous experience with urban living labs, but also a little bit from the work that our university and our institute has been doing. Yes, as Rob mentioned, I worked some years ago in the GUST project, which aimed to examine, inform, and advance the governance of sustainability transitions in cities through urban living labs. So not university living labs, but urban. But the university living labs, I think they connect quite well to urban living labs, because often university campuses are located in cities or close to urban infrastructure. Here we had 4 partners and we were leading this project. And as part of the project, we defined the urban living labs. There was a question I saw by Wade in the chat. How do you define the living labs? So for us, urban living labs, the sites, geographically institutionally bounded sites in cities devised to design, test and learn from social and technical innovation in real time. But defining them even further, we identified 5 key characteristics of urban living labs, which I decided to kind of place here and try to look at the report on early university living labs, in which ways these urban living lab characteristics are resembling or addressed through the report of university living labs. Are they actually relevant, these characteristics, to university living labs? And the first characteristic is the geographical and institutional embeddedness of living lab. Indeed, university living labs are located in university campuses, so that fits well. Another characteristic on leadership and ownership, that a living lab, to be able to operate, it needs to be led by someone, and someone has to own it, in a sense that owning the results and evaluation and so on. This is quite well covered also in the discussion of operations of university living labs in the report. Then key characteristics are about experimentation and learning. So the living lab approach is about experimenting with innovations, and here experimentation with solutions in real world setting is covered very well in the report, and that is about actually testing and exploring socio-technical solutions. And often this experimentation happens and learning happens for the students as well, because it is the university. At the same time, we also found that it is also important to, you know, in order to learn, it is important to have evaluation procedures in place and to evaluate what is happening in the living lab. But often these are missing, or in the urban living labs, this is actually a component. If it is done by knowledge institutes, it is done by academic partners. So this is something where the report maybe can be lifted a bit more, how the evaluation procedures are planned in university living labs, because they are the ones that will stimulate the learning and the refinement of the goals, the refinement of how they implement it, and the outcome of the results later on. So how do we encourage this more formalized learning, but also how is informal learning being undertaken by the key partners? That could be something maybe to reflect a bit more. And who is learning in this living lab? Is it the leaders of the living lab? Is the participants, the actors, the users? Stepping into the kind of user component, that was another important characteristic of the urban living lab, that participation and involvement of users is very important, and receiving their feedback is important in order for the solutions to be then legitimate and used by the users, accepted, adopted, and so on. And this is, I think, the component that is reflected upon, in a sense, very briefly. There is a sentence saying that experiential knowledge of end users is recognized to be important in the report. But I think something that could leave the report a bit more, it's reflecting a bit more on the actually user involvement. So who are the users of these university living labs? Is it a particular group, or it's all citizens? How could they be, how are they involved? How could they be involved maybe in a more efficient ways? And what is kind of the level of their involvement? And as one suggestion tool, we also have developed this framework of user involvement in urban living labs again, that classifies different levels of user involvement, from non-participation at all and kind of to just one-way information provision, towards a more two-ways consultation and co-creation, which is an ultimate goal, where you have the co-creation of the innovations and solutions with the users. So this is something that I thought might be useful to consider and maybe to lift a bit this user component in the report. And last but not least, there are many synergies that I recognize, or common sort of challenges that we encountered with studying in urban living labs, is that, yes, one is the big problem of continuity. So how do we ensure that living labs are not just projects for a certain amount of years, and then when they end, everything ends, and then we can't actually support their impact in the longer term. So there is a need to secure this long-term funding and more sort of institutionalized way of working. So this is definitely what I recognize and the challenges that have been placed in the report. But I'll stop here, and we can discuss also more later at the open panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Yulia. Great points based on very decent experience in a project that I've been familiar with and that I've read about in various publications. And it's great to get your summary here and your thoughts about some of the analogs, I guess, between urban living labs and university living labs, and key points around learning and inclusion or potential exclusion of users and who the users are, as well as the important point around evaluation procedures, something that is often lacking in all sorts of experiments, whether those are in university living labs or otherwise. So really great points. So we'll move over to the last panelist of today, Professor John Robinson. And John is a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and the School of Environment at the University of Toronto. And he's also an adjunct professor at Copenhagen Business School. At the University of Toronto, he's a presidential advisor on the environment, climate change, and sustainability. And John's research focuses on many things, including sustainable buildings and cities, climate change mitigation, adaptation and sustainability, participatory backcasting and future studies, urban living labs, sustainability transitions and transformations, art and sustainability, community engagement and transdisciplinary knowledge co-production, the role of universities in sustainability transitions, and the history and philosophy of sustainability. So, John, great to have you here, and I hand over to you for the last contribution to this panel.
Thanks very much, Rob. I'm very happy to be here. I think this is an excellent report, full of very useful information. I especially like the definition of university living labs as including both on-campus and off-campus activities that are often separated. And I think it is good to think of them in an integrated kind of way. The quotations are great because they give a bit of the flavor of the 18 different universities that are quoted, and the list of goals, functions, challenges, and enabling mechanisms, I think will be really useful to readers of the report who are interested in creating or accelerating and advancing living lab activities on in their universities. So I'd like to make 3 comments, all intended to add to the excellent work in this report. The first 2 reflect a slightly different take on living labs that we have at U of T than that is mostly talked about in the report. So it's maybe a supplementary kind of perspective. And the third point will connect quite closely to what Yulia just said about who's working with stakeholders. So comment number 1. The report mainly talks about private sector partnerships. For example, in section 3.4 on partnerships and engagement. I think it's important to include explicitly and discuss public sector and civil society partnerships. They're a crucial part of, I believe, of any real living lab set of activities and programs. And these 3 sectors, the public sector, the private sector, and civil society, are quite different, I think, in terms of how to do living lab activities. At the University of Toronto, for example, 3 different parts of the campus are working with these different sectors. We have engineering and business researchers working with and often funded by the private sector. We have social scientists and policy analysts working with and often funded by the public sector, by government agencies. And then we have social scientists and humanists who work with civil society partners, NGO, anti-poverty groups, indigenous communities, et cetera, and are not funded by their partners, but are mostly funded by the research funding councils and foundations. These three groups are all actively engaged with different sectors of society, but not very well connected at all on the university. They don't tend to talk to each other. There's even oppositional dimensions to the interactions that do happen. So I think we need to really think seriously about who is the university engaging with. And I think we need tailored responses to these different kinds of living lab opportunities. They take a different form in these different sectors, perhaps. My second comment is I think there's a big difference between university living lab labs, programs, projects, and courses. The report talks about the need for more resources to support the living lab activities, for example, in section 4.2 on ad hoc and limited resourcing. But this is perhaps more important for creating formalized living lab structures to support living lab research than for other possible forms of living lab activities. So I think it's important to recognize there are maybe different pathways here. For example, we could also develop highly distributed faculty-led activities based primarily on coursework and potentially paid internships as well. That's a whole route for living lab activities that's rather different because it's rooted in courses and in the educational side. It has the other three dimensions that are mentioned in the report, but it's rooted in the educational function. And if that is done, it's still important, as the report suggests, to have some kind of central coordination. This can be relatively small. At U of T, we have pretty limited central resources, part of a full-time project manager, and we work with the three U of T sustainability offices, and they contribute. But basically, we're working with faculty, and in the context of their teaching experiential learning courses and campus as living lab courses. The result is a highly flexible management structure. We could therefore also think about supporting a distributed ecosystem of university living lab activities and projects based on courses, a little more bottom up with less structure needed perhaps than a formalized living lab process. I think this has implications for the enabler, the two of the enablers, the one on coordination and the one on investments. My third point is the need to address very explicitly transdisciplinary knowledge co-production methods. If we're going to do living lab projects, we need to pay a lot of attention to methodological issues, how to do this effectively. As noted in section 3.1 on the research process, 3.4 on partnerships and engagement, and in the recommendation section, this should involve knowledge co-production and research co-design approaches. But there isn't much in the report about what that means. Since most research at the universities conform to a more extractive model of research where society is the source of data and a second-order audience at best, faculty, postdocs, and grad students are not typically trained in transdisciplinary knowledge co-production methods and approaches. For those of us who do this kind of work, it has been mainly learning by doing, trial and error with a lot of error, and therefore I think it's quite useful to provide some training in undertaking these kinds of partnerships with non-academic partners and perhaps codifying some good practices. Living lab work, I think, involves moving from more extractive to more reciprocal approaches to engagement with non-academic partners, from treating them primarily as sources of data to seeing them as partners in the research, from primarily academic outputs and audiences to having multiple non-academic products and audiences, from researcher-driven forms of engagement to co-design of the work itself. So I think this bears some serious consideration. I think there's some rules of thumb that come out of a lot of living lab work that's been going on for a long time around the world. For example, we adopt two principles: no net increase and mutual benefit when we work with partners across the campus, but also off the campus as well. We need to contribute, in other words, to existing agendas on both sides. The partnership has to meet the existing agenda of all of the partners in some kind of way. A second possible principle or rule of thumb is starting with projects that are not defined by the academy, they're not found in the literature, they're not defined by faculty, they're defined by practitioners in the field, and work back from those very practical projects. This works very well for student projects. The concept of piggybacking on existing activities rather than always creating new ones. Can we find ways that the university can aid processes that are already going on instead of creating them de novo? That can be very helpful. Can we add a research layer and connective tissue to those existing already developing projects and activities? Climate action out in the community, for example. That's something we as academics can do very well, adding a research layer, adding connective tissue among different kinds of projects in different parts of the world. Should we not, in all our Living Lab projects, aim to simultaneously enhance the project, but also build the community? Is that an explicit goal of this kind of work? I think it's implicit in some of the discussion in the report. It might be useful to make it a little more explicit. And then finally, I want to recognize that Living Lab research is high risk, especially for junior academics. It does take more time. It requires a lot of non-academic products, tend to be published in interdisciplinary journals. There's a loss of control over the research agenda. Inescapably, if you're going to do co-creation, you have to not be the sole entity in control of what happens. There can be a disconnect between academic and partner timelines, and there are deep funding challenges. Often to get funding for this kind of work, you have to go to academic funding councils who require a highly academic proposal to provide funding. This violates research co-creation processes. So there's a real challenge even at the very front end of some of this work. So I think it's important as much as possible to build protections as well as training in transdisciplinary knowledge co-production into the process. So those are my 3 comments. I hope they're useful. Thanks very much for involving me in this process.
Thank you very much, John, for really excellent comments, as always, and pointing, I guess, overall to the needs of taking perhaps differentiated approaches to what works and what kind of settings, in what kind of disciplines and what kind of partnerships, in terms of how to approach research, how to identify projects, etc. And also really great that you brought about transdisciplinary co-production methods and being more reciprocal in our research to give back to our partners as an alternative to the more extractive model that you emphasize. So really, really great points. And now I'm happy to move on to open up the floor for a facilitated debate. So again, a reminder to the audience, and I can see already some questions coming into the Q&A. If you have any questions, comments, please pop them in the Q&A. I'll try to moderate to my best abilities. First, I would like to invite all panelists and presenter to come live. So Catherine, Hubert, Julia, John, and Paris, so that the audience can see you. I think we've got everyone. Yep. And I would like to start to open up the conversation by asking a simple question. And that question is related to the fact that Living Labs do come with a lot of promises in many different ways. And I'm keen to hear from the panelists, to what degree, what has been, in your view, the most important outcome so far, but with establishing or setting up a Living Lab, whether in your own experience or whether you have seen that elsewhere happening. So what has been accomplished through a Living Lab, which would not have been accomplished in other ways? And maybe, Catherine, I'll throw at you first that question, and also invite other panelists to jump in along the way.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. I think that for us, the University of Tasmania recently received from Elsevier #1 ranking for climate action, and that comes from academic research in climate change, teaching, climate education, operations and engagement. And a big part of that is divestment from fossil fuels. And I don't think that would have come about if we hadn't had such a dedicated group of both community members, alumni, students and staff that have been working on this for such a long period of time.
Thank you, Catherine. Any of the other panelists who would like to respond to this? Yes, Julia, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think what is, or what I see as the most important outcome of setting up living labs, again, more perhaps urban living labs, but where we have academic partners and university partners, is this experiential setup that opens opportunities for partnerships and collaborations that may not be always possible with the institutional budgets. So if, particularly for municipalities, so if you have municipalities that run on budgets, they cannot often collaborate with businesses, but experiential setups, external funding opens opportunities to also collaborate with businesses. That is because of the rules of the market and so on, and the open competition. This we have seen in actually many cities around the world, that it's seen as a possibility because it is a living lab, a test bed, a trial, and so on. So it's branded in a different way than a regular business as usual. Then it opens for these collaborations and new setups and exploring ideas together.
Thanks, Julia. So next to the education point that Catherine made, it's also the partnership point that that is beneficial when setting up a living lab. Hubert, you have your hand raised as well.
Yeah. No, I think it's one of the questions actually is being proud of what we've did at TU Delft when we started Green Village. It's actually a field lab. It's a physical place, an area where people can meet each other. And I was very interested by the comment of Professor Robinson to have these engineered, funded by private parties, policymakers by public parties, and the social researchers by the NGOs. Those people need to come together at a place. And I'm actually really proud that it was a green field in 2015, and now there are 15 to 20,000 people of all different levels, of all different disciplines, come together and get inspired by and starting to get real projects. And we have made the platform that it is not an ad hoc project anymore. So it's really start to becoming institutionalized. Excuse me.
Thanks, Herbert. And John, you've got your hand up, and maybe also respond to Herbert's point.
Yeah, three things I think of in our sort of student-oriented living lab activities. One is the partnerships that's already been mentioned by Catherine. That's crucial. We have incredibly strong relationships now with the City of Toronto and the Environment and Climate Division in particular, who run the climate strategy for the city because of these student projects. I've been putting 50 students a year to work for the city on climate action in the city. And those relationships are like gold. They need to be done. They can only really be done by this kind of really intense interactive engagement. Secondly, we get students who are skilled in actually the more practical dimensions of achieving sustainability. All our students can write great papers on how to solve all the sustainability problems in principle. They all can do that because that's what they've done for year after year. But in an actual jurisdiction with a limited budget and limited mandate and certain politics, to learn about that's really like gold. So they're developing a form of knowledge they can't get in ordinary courses, I believe. And the third thing I'll mention is we have a database now of 387 and growing student projects, living lab projects, that every time a student has a new living lab project, they go to the database so that they can learn what's already been done, don't reinvent the wheel, build on what's already been there. They're downloadable, they're coded by the SDGs. So we're building up a knowledge base of student projects that is quite powerful. We've had workshops with the city where we synthesized some of those student projects and presented them to municipal officials. And so it's quite a useful database, I would say.
Thanks, thanks, John.
Nice.
Observing that the attention goes towards education and partnership, I guess much more so than perhaps to research or the operation side of Living Labs as well, which is interesting that this is where this question takes us. Perhaps that's where the most value is to be seen in the first place.
Sorry, I should have mentioned that ours is also highly operational. We have a lot of Living Lab projects with operational staff, just as we do with the city or other partners. And I think that's a crucial part. I agree with the report on that front.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks for that clarification. There's a few questions coming in through the Q&A, and I'm keen to start introducing some of those in the discussion. The first question is from Wade Kelly, and we've heard already a couple of definitions from University Living Labs, including one in Paris's presentation, and Julia brought up a definition of an urban living lab. Wade's keen to, he's making the point that there's indeed a range of definitions of what living labs are, and it would be great to hear from each panelist what their one-sentence description of a living lab is. So maybe, Hubert, I'll go to you first for this one.
Living Lab is a place where you can accelerate innovations, multidisciplinary.
Great, thank you. So that's emphasizing the innovation part, which I think relates to the sort of the translation promise of a living lab and the partnership promise of a living lab as well. It produces innovations that are socially relevant and can be taken up by societal actors. John, would you like to tell us your definition of a living lab?
Yeah, I guess I would say it's something like a venue for transdisciplinary knowledge co-production processes and partnerships intended to help achieve the sustainability transition.
Thanks, thanks, John. The platform or the forum idea is really interesting here as well. I think that's related to the way Jack also talked about the approach of living labs being a social infrastructure within a university setting. So great definition there as well. We've already heard from Julia and Paris, but so maybe I'll throw to Catherine first, and then Paris and Julia, if you want to make a contribution to this question, please feel free to do so as well. So Catherine, you first.
Yeah, I think that the Living Lab brings our campus alive and is the reason that we can bring people together. So bringing our operations, our education, our research, partnerships all together. And just in answering, I also wanted to respond to the question about research, and our SIPS program and our Living Lab allows us to do research that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So in our operations, we don't have the resources to do research, and sometimes because of budgets and other time pressures, people do things that are called research, but they're not actually researchers, and they're under a short period of time to make decisions. But having the SIPS program means that we can work on something and actually do research. So when we're looking at things like how do we provide food on campus, this provides us with an opportunity to do research that we wouldn't otherwise have. And we may be doing surveys that are not actually based in, sorry, I'm trying to say this diplomatically. We may be doing things that are called qualitative research, but they're not actually qualitative research. And so, yeah, working with students and academics on campus projects allows us to be more rigorous in the work and decision making that we do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Catherine, also for bringing back research, the research benefits or the research implications of taking a living lab approach into the discussion. I'll add to this from my own experience with being involved in a number of living lab oriented research project is that I've learned that being engaged in Living Labs as a researcher, it actually leads me to ask different kinds of research questions. They start from a more pragmatic point of view, as John also alluded to in his panel contribution, that there are ongoing projects that we as researchers can add to, and it takes time and effort to translate that into academic research questions. But these are really interesting research questions as well that I wouldn't have come up just sitting behind my desk doing my research. So I think that's I think is an implication. And then you get all the benefits that research is likely to be more interesting to societal actors. So great to hear from that. Paris and Julia, would you like to add to the definition question from Wade? Being aware you already provided definitions, but maybe you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think many things have been said. I could just say that Living Labs, university Living Labs are also experiential sites that build on transdisciplinary collaboration and knowledge co-production with users. I would like to emphasize this bit again in real time. That is also then with embedded evaluations and learnings that we can actively learn. So we not just experiment and try things out, but we need to be more persistent in terms of learning that we achieve and how we document, formalize it.
Thanks, Julia. Paris?
Yes, I'd just like to add that I guess what struck me in preparing this report is just how diverse Living Labs can be. And I think regarding the definition of a Living Lab, I think the Living Lab concept allows universities and university stakeholders to define a Living Lab from the context of their university and their capabilities, their interests. So certainly when it comes to, for example, technological universities, engineering universities, there is that closer leaning towards the private sector, technology commercialization and the like. But as we've seen in other contexts like University of Tasmania with the strong teaching focus, as well as Toronto's work with developing applied learning courses, I think, there's great potential in really leveraging and building on what's already at the university. And in terms of who the users are, I think there are lots of different ways to view this. The university itself is a user in some cases where they're procuring technological solutions to energy management, for example. But also students are really interesting as researchers in themselves, but also inhabitants of university campuses. So there's a great diversity there as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Paris. And I'm just going to stay with you for a while for the second question. There's from the audience, there's a great question from Ariel Liebman, who's the director of the Monash-ENGIE Institute. And it's referring back to what Jack talked about establishing this microgrid living lab at Monash, where the philosophy was initially, we do this at campus, but campus represents in many ways, it's an analog in many ways to a part of a city. So we can learn about how to do this in other urban areas as well. So the question that Ariel is asking, how can we use the more contained university living lab context to support, inform, or generalize to larger scales? So there's also a scaling question to that. And Paris, maybe you would like to respond initially to this question.
Perhaps when it comes to using the campus as a living lab, I guess it part of it is taking risks that perhaps other contexts won't allow, because we think of it as a kind of protected space, thinking of universities as pushing the boundaries of knowledge and practice. And so I think that is a critical part of scaling, where you're really seeing what's possible and then facilitating that knowledge translation and learning through partnerships and through knowledge dissemination.
Thank you, Paris, and I invite any of the other panel members to respond to this question as well. John, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's two routes. One is the route of taking the campus as living lab work and trying to take it out and see how applicable it might be. At U of T, we have partnerships with the Toronto Board of Trade and with other organizations where the operational work we're doing on, say, carbon management in buildings, on deep retrofits, and all of these kinds of things are being offered to partners out in the community and as points of discussion for potential application beyond. But I think there's a whole other route, which is very different, and that is having living labs in the community that are community defined. So I'll give you an example. We're proposing some work to go in and work with 2 marginalized communities in Toronto, low-income neighborhoods that are usually excluded from the policy arena, and try to develop pathways to a better life for those neighborhoods that are somehow congruent with climate action and sustainability. Those are not about taking our knowledge and giving it to the communities at all. They have to be community-led, they have to be community-directed. So I think they're a very different kind of scaling question. And I think both can be really fruitful.
Thanks, John. And I'm keen to throw in another question at this stage, following up the example that you gave, and that's a question from Gerard Healy, asking about how do you manage expectations about benefits with different participants in a living lab. And this is a really important question. Whenever you go into a community, you are asking time and efforts from them, and they will also be looking at you to deliver on things. And often they can't wait 2 or 3 years to come up with a publication. And even they don't want a publication, they want real benefits, as an example. So how could you respond to that question and say, how do you manage these kind of questions, balancing between research side, community benefits, maybe pressures to deliver economic benefits to industry partners and so on?
Yeah, maybe I can answer that one.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead, Hubert, and I'll go to John after that one.
Oh, sorry. Oh,
no, that's all right. Go ahead.
No. Go.
Yeah. It's really difficult in the sense that stakeholders do all have different languages. So you have to be able to talk different languages, from the project developer, from the investor, from the researcher, from the regulator, from the local authority. So that is a skill that you need to develop, or that somebody within the Living Lab platform needs to have. But if you're able to do that, then for all the stakes, you need to actually monitor the stake. And we do have some good examples of that where we really actually had only need to invest 20% of the actual capex, where 80% is co-founded by the investors, because they just believe in the story, and the researcher can do where he is good in, he or she, in researching. So you have to play and coordinate that part, and if you do that well, then there's really big potential for executing living labs.
Thanks, Hubert. And John, would you like to respond? I'm also keen to hear Julia's thoughts about this, having been researching urban living labs for a long time. John, you want to go first?
Sure. So from a student point of view, if the Living Lab projects are oriented around course delivery or paid internships, for example, what we do is we go to our partners and we say, what's on your to-do list, but you're not going to get to it this year because of bandwidth constraints. But if you had a couple of students working away on it, it would be very helpful. And so the projects come entirely from the practitioner side, and the students are told that, and they present to them. So they are trying to do work that will actually meet real world needs out in the community, not what the literature is saying. The students typically, by the way, love this, because it's the chance that their work will actually be used is much higher, because the problems come from the users themselves. So that's a way to get them working on projects that have some practical relevance. Of course, any student project may or may not help the client, the partner, but they're always interested in reading them. And they love working with students. It's so interesting. So many people out in the community love working with students. We should never lead with faculty. Faculty are kind of very boring. Students are really interesting to the world relative to us. So in my experience, it's been a very positive thing, and the students have felt that they're actually contributing in some way. They don't get to necessarily see exactly how it's used, but they get this sense that there's an audience that wants to hear what they're doing. On the more serious kind of researchy things, like some of the operational stuff, where we have faculty doing research on deep retrofits, as I mentioned earlier, that's a little different story. And then you have to really negotiate something that works in both directions. But that's less student oriented and more faculty oriented.
Thanks, John. I would really like to discuss more about this as we're about to go into deep retrofitting project ourselves at the moment, which we're designing. I'm going to give the last words now to Julia. We're running a bit out of time. Julia, just some last thoughts from you on this panel.
Thank you. I think it is really important what has been told a bit earlier. I think Hubert talked about creating a common vision about this living lab for different actors and stakeholders that are in there, and speaking different languages in a way, but also kind of fueling this vision. So sometimes the projects can take a long time, but there where leadership matters a lot. So how the leader is communicating. Communication is key with the community, with the actors, regular communication, but also communicating about the contribution of this community to larger agendas, to the benefits. Doesn't need to wait for a long publication in the academic journal. It can be other means of communication, making them visible, showing they are valuable through blogs and social media and so on. This project is ongoing. They are contributing. So showing the sense of their belonging and contributions and benefits to the larger agendas that this project is meaningful. I think that also helps them being engaged and seeing the purpose and understanding that why they are there, and that it might take a bit of time, but they are towards this bigger vision that will be eventually an outcome of it. But it's not like disappearing. You need to be all the time with them, communicating both ways.
Thanks, Julia. And that points to a very important notion of trust in all of these processes. Trust and time are critical ingredients of any transdisciplinary approach, including living labs. I will round up with one final brief question to Catherine. And that's, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently if you would go about setting up a living lab again?
What would I do differently? I'm not sure. I probably agree both with what Julia and John have just been saying, and one of my reflections from both of their points was that sometimes projects fail, and that's okay, as long as they're well designed. And we had a fantastic student who worked with us the year before last, and she got to meet and interview people across Australia about a program that we weren't sure whether we wanted to embark on at the University of Tasmania. And her recommendation came back and said, I don't think this is a good idea, but it was a great experience for her. It was fantastic learning for us because it saved us the time of going down the path of researching that opportunity. So I think as long as your programs are well designed, and I love what John was saying about knowing and meeting people where they're at and what their priority is, knowing what's happening in the community. I think it can be a good experience for everyone, even if the outcome is to not embark on something new.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Catherine, to make the point that sometimes failure is part of the process, and you can still get a lot out of things that don't go well or don't go through. I have to round up now for time reasons. unfortunately, we couldn't address all the questions. Everyone in the audience, please do contribute your questions in other ways by email or reach out to us, and we'll try and respond to those the best way possible. I would like to thank all the panelists, myself, for, you've done a great job in bringing your thoughts and ideas to this. And clearly, there's still work to be done, but bringing together this excellent group of international scholars and practitioners and working on living labs, in my view, has been a great experience. So thank you all. I would like to hand over to Keith for the last thank you and closing of the session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much indeed, Rob. Thank you very much indeed, everyone who participated today, all the attendees who engaged and asked questions and who listened and learned. I've learned a lot. Dr. Hadfield, thank you very much indeed. It's been a wonderful piece of research to read and to look at. I encourage everybody to download and read the full report. Thank you very much to our panelists. The time just flew by, which I think is a fabulous example of a really engaging report and a really engaging piece of interaction from everybody. So look, let's just wrap it there. It's just flown by. Thank you very much indeed, and have a great afternoon and morning, everyone.